You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation.
Waterloop.
Hi, this is Travis with Waterloop. Water conservation is very important to me, and I bet it is to all of you. That's why I use High Sierra shower heads in my house, and I'm so happy to have them as a supporter of this podcast. High Sierra carries the EPA WaterSense label for efficiency and uses 40% less water than conventional low-flow shower heads. 40%. The model I have uses just 1.5 gallons per minute. And because of their unique nozzle design, it's patented. Nobody else has it. It maximizes efficiency of water and energy use, but doesn't sacrifice on performance. You still get a powerful shower. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Excited for this episode to talk about a pending film project, Blood of the West, all about the Colorado River. I'm with J.R. Robinson, the filmmaker and director of Blood of the West. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Yeah, I think we got connected probably over Instagram. And I was really stunned by the photography that you were putting up of just the landscape out there in the Colorado River Basin as you were starting to talk about developing Blood of the West. And I know right now this project is in development. You're raising funds. We can talk about that for sure. But I'm excited about it. The story, the photos, everything caught my attention. So definitely looking forward to digging into it. So I guess Blood of the West. What is the project here?
So it's kind of morphed over the years, but it's basically turned into what I like to think of as the most comprehensive look at the Colorado River that's ever been put on video or film. So I'm looking at it as being an 8-part episode series for streaming distribution that sort of tells the whole story of the river from top to bottom and lets us sort of dive in deep into some of the issues facing the Colorado River, looking at each of the 7 basin states and then looking at sort of the past, present, and future of the river as it goes. As I was sort of studying and researching it, like it felt like there's so much story there that I wanted to tell it in this sort of episodic format that let me sort of dive deep into it. I make the analogy that I envision it as kind of like Ken Burns' Civil War, but with drone photography.
Love it.
Yeah. Or like, I was talking to someone recently and they were like, oh, it's kind of like The Last Dance. And, that sort of, deep dive into this sort of like try to get as much information out there as possible and do it in a way that is for the benefit of the river, which is my ultimate goal.
Yeah. Well, how did you end up focusing on this project and on the Colorado River? I think you've kind of been a bit of an explorer, right? Spent some time out hiking and in a lot of these places. How did this relationship form?
Well, I mean, it's exactly that. It came about because I was hiking and I was exploring these areas. So the first initial contact with the Colorado Basin and the Colorado watershed was with my graduate thesis film, actually. So back in 2009, I was shooting my thesis film called New World Water. And it was a sort of sci-fi post-apocalyptic look at sort of what happens to the world when the water runs out and everybody is, forced to live under the iron fist of a water company.
Not too far-fetched science fiction, right? Like, you've seen some of this stuff.
I don't know.
yeah, exactly.
I don't know now. But I mean, I was looking at it. The original script that I got was like coal was the resource, and I didn't want to tell a story about coal because it didn't seem timely. and I wanted to do something that sort of looked at sort of the environment and looked at sort of the contemporary state of affairs when I made it. And I had been reading and watching a few documentaries about water and water issues, and just sort of generally like living in Southern California, understanding that water is so important there, and uh, you know, growing up watching Chinatown and knowing how important water is to LA. Um, that became the impetus for the for that short film. But I wound up shooting it. I was looking for like a post-apocalyptic landscape, and I wound up shooting it at the Salton Sea. I
Hmm.
had seen some pictures, and I was like, "Oh, that looks like what I want." And I wound up going out there, and the more I talked to people out there as we were getting permits or finding locations, the more I started to understand sort of the history and the background of the Salton Sea. We shot at a hydroponics greenhouse, and we talked about water issues and how water affects sort of general farming issues in the Imperial and Coachella valleys. So I learned a lot about it there, and then basically took that information and put it into this sort of fictional thing, but it always kind of stuck with me.
Hmm.
And so I started doing some still photography work just on my own. My first dive into the Colorado Plateau, I drove out to Zion, and I spent some time out in Zion and fell in love with that place.
Hmm.
But then I went to the Grand Canyon, and I just started doing little photography trips out to the Southwest because it was so beautiful.
Hmm.
But every place I went to shoot, it kept coming back to, like, I would read like the placards, or I'd read like the things at visitor centers, or I'd talk to like rangers or locals, and everything kept coming back to water issues, water issues. And so I started diving into it more, and started reading about it more. And over 10 years, I basically have been just sort of obsessed with the Southwest and the Colorado Basin, and the issues facing it. Um, and I started looking at it as sort of this holistic thing. One of the places that's most important to me along the watershed is the confluence of the Green and the Colorado and Canyonlands. So when I decided to do my Pacific Crest Trail hike, I did it because I hiked out to that confluence, and I was like, yeah, I could do a big hike. I don't. That was a small hike. I wound up turning it into like a 24 miler, um, that was like a day hike. But I was like, yeah, like I had just gotten knee surgery the year before, and I was unsure about my physical ability to do things again.
Right.
And so that was the sort of the first big hike that I did, that I was like, yeah, I could do this. And so that has a special place in my heart. And I started reading about John Wesley Powell. I read Wallace Stegner's Beyond the 100th Meridian, which is an amazing book. And I read about John Wesley Powell in that regard, and started diving into some of the issues in terms of land management and water management. And I became obsessed with that PAL map of the state lines that are drawn based on watersheds.
Hmm.
And like I was looking at that, and I was like, and the more I read about it, it's like we have this series of decisions really starting from like the 1850s, but even before that, that have all sort of like funneled into this sort of mismanagement of this important river. And then in studying that, you realize just how important the river is. Um, it's 40 million people's drinking water. It's food for most of the country.
Yeah.
It's the reason we have lettuce in the winter. It's the reason we have fruit in the winter. Um, and if we continue mismanaging it, like, where does that lead us? And so I started diving into that. Um, and I wanted to. I'd been out of filmmaking for a few years. Um, I stepped away from my job in the film industry back in 2015, partly to focus on my still photography
Hmm.
and to connect more with the outdoors. Um, but also, like, it wasn't like the right scenario for me. And so this is my attempt to sort of get back into telling stories through a motion picture medium rather than just still photography.
Yeah,
And be able to sort of
blending your
yeah,
background in film with your focus on photography and visual and nature and all you've learned.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, let's take a little trip through your
Okay.
storyboard here. Through
Okay.
your kind of
Sounds good.
the 8 episodes you have planned out, and I'd love if maybe for each one you could share a photo that kind of reflects the focus of that episode or that part of the basin. I know you're planning to basically kind of go from source to sea, right? And then
Mhm.
after we take that journey through the film, I want to ask a little bit about some of the crazy logistics you have for
Yeah.
hiking and paddling and getting out there to do this. Anyway, so yeah, let's start with how your film will kick off.
So this is Gore Canyon, which is along the Upper Grand in the West Slope of Colorado. So this is episode one. The reason I sort of looked at this is it's one of those sort of last sort of wild, untamed canyons in Colorado. Um, but really, the story of the Upper Grand, as I see it, is the Continental Divide, sort of splitting the state in two, and you have this East Slope, West Slope faction or dialectic that's going on between the two sides of the Rocky Mountains, where most of the water is on the West Slope and most of the people are on the East Slope.
Hmm.
And really sort of diving into what that means, and on a historical um, way of looking at it, looking at the headwaters of the Colorado as this sort of boundary between cultures. So historically, you see the Utes were on the West Slope, the Arapaho were on the East Slope. You see that the mountain ground for hunting, but mostly it was that was a divide that separated sort of the western part of what's now the United States from the eastern part. And the flows of populations went along river valleys, and so when the Utes came in, or when the Paleolithic people came in to the Rocky Mountains, they came up the Colorado River, which is different from how the Europeans did it. The
Hmm.
Europeans saw the mountains as an obstacle to overcome, and they literally came over the mountains into these valleys and started pulling water out to support their agriculture and cities on the eastern side of the mountains. Um, so that's sort of episode one, is
Hmm.
the Upper Grand, and I refer to it as the Upper Grand instead of the Colorado here because that was the original name of the river. Originally, it was the Grand River, and then the Green River, and then the Colorado started at their junction. So the Upper Grand is a separate tributary in some ways, and it has its own politics and it has its own issues within the greater Colorado system. The other thing I'm hoping to look at with this is this that it sort of encapsulates the entire story of the river as you go from headwaters to sea. It is a headwaters episode, but as you sort of follow it from the mountains down to the Utah border, and it's really the state of Colorado is what we mostly talk about in this episode. Um, as you follow it down to that border, you really see everything in microcosm. You see mountains, you see transbasin diversions up in the mountains, you see agriculture versus urban use, and then you see down at the bottom, you see some of the water quality issues that we'll deal with down at the end. So it's a good sort of like encapsulation of the whole river
Hmm.
in a small section of it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. That's great. You got to start at the start, right?
Yeah.
Um, cool. What I love about this is that even without the film being made yet, the way you've laid out these episodes and have the photos to go along with it, and what you've learned, the knowledge you've built from all this research it's a great educational tour, even without having the film done yet. So that's why I've been so excited about this project coming to reality. So let's move along to
Oh, thank you.
episode two. Yeah.
Yeah, so episode 2 is the Green River, and it's another headwaters episode. But what I find most interesting about the Green River is it's a really excellent encapsulation of Western history within one small watershed. And you can really track the history of the West as we consider the history of the West. It's what I refer to as the myth of the West, um, because we can track sort of the Euro-American expansion from the east to the west just by following the river downstream. So starting at the headwaters up in the Wind River Range, you see that the first Europeans that came over were mountain men, and they were the beaver trappers, and the fur trade was critical up in the Wind Rivers. And so you can start tracking based on the resource extraction and exploitation of the beaver as the first overcapitalized resource in the West. So you can start there. You can start moving downstream, and then you get to immigrant trails and the gold rush and people moving across the state of Wyoming and having to ford the river in order to get from east to west. And then you continue down from that, and you can dive into Powell's expedition, which started in Green River, Wyoming, and then continued down from there. And you can talk about outlaw culture, because basically all the, like Butch Cassidy, for example, like had all of his hideouts along the Green River, which is fascinating. But you can tie it back to, again, to water, because the reason they turned to banditry and turned to an outlaw way of life is because they didn't have enough water. They were originally farmers. They were irrigators, and they couldn't get enough water to actually have a sustainable farm. So that's part of Western mythology that is all centered around water again.
I did not know that. That's
Yeah,
fascinating. And then you just look
yeah,
at you just start to look at a picture, and just I'm always just stunned by the Western landscape. It's just so gorgeous, and even a photo like this, just inspiring stuff.
thanks. Yeah. This is Flaming Gorge,
Mm.
which is there are 2 dams in Wyoming that we're looking at, but Flaming Gorge Dam is the biggest, and it's one of the first real instances of a dam really destroying a really important ecological place. So the way Powell described Flaming Gorge, we'll never see that again, which is one of the interesting things.
Yeah.
And I call it the myth of the West, because the way I see it is kind of it's a propaganda system that was set up, throughout the 1800s, using the mountain men, using the outlaws, using the immigrant trails, using this myth that we have infinitely exploitable resources in the West to pull people out there, to expand the borders of the West, to achieve Jefferson's ideal of a coast-to-coast country, and to capitalize on the treaties and the purchases, the land purchases that we had made. So a lot of it is this mythology built on, if you come out west, you'll make your living, and you'll become rich because there's infinite riches in the West.
Yeah. Well, think about
Yeah.
think about even now, right? Like people still are flocking to Arizona and Las Vegas and Colorado and Southern California, thinking that there's plenty. There's no resource restriction. There's no issue. Meanwhile, water scarcity is getting to be at a really critical level. So it's interesting.
Exactly.
People still head out that way.
Yeah. Well, and you have this sense of rugged individualism, which, hey, I'm all for people thinking that they can be self-sustaining and self-supporting, and I would like to think of that myself. But the reality of the West is that everything is sort of propped up by resource scarcity, and by everything is limited in terms of how much sustainability and how much you can actually control your own destiny, because you are reliant on the realities of what it means to be on the west side of the Rocky Mountains.
Sure.
So, episode 3 is Canyon Country. This is really the Utah section of the Colorado River. So it's about the confluence of these two initial tributaries, the Grand and the Green, and how they become one. But also, it's a series of dialectics that's set up throughout this episode, which I find really interesting. The first is the transition from a resource-based economy in the region to a recreation-based economy. So the rise of the recreation industry is really well encapsulated in Canyonlands and Arches and Lake Powell, and shows this sort of new economy in the West that is still growing and is increasingly the most important industry for these states. And what does that mean for the future of the river? But it's also, so I talked about dialectics. You're looking at a story of two canyon systems. You have the basically the Cataract Canyon system, right, which is the area around Canyonlands National Park, and then you have the Glen Canyon system, which is the area now submerged in the Powell. So that's a dialectic that I'm looking at. It's two rivers, right, the Green and the Grand, coming together. So the difference in the way those two rivers are managed, both on a local and a federal level. And then you have two different cities, one that's Moab and one that's Green River, Utah. Those are two towns that are going in opposite directions from my perspective. So Moab's on the rise because they have transitioned their economy primarily to a recreation economy. Green River's on the decline because they are still holding on to a lot of resource extraction, resource-based capitalization on agriculture and things like that. And then you have Cataract versus Glen, which Canyonlands versus Glen Canyon National Recreation Area is another dialectic in terms of federal management over these areas. You have two federal agencies that are managing these systems in very different ways. And you see it ecologically. Canyonlands itself is one of the richest desert ecologies that you can walk through. And it's fascinating to go through all the crypto soils and see that you have 1,000 years of growth, just within a couple inches of cryptobiotic soil. But then you go down to Glen Canyon and you see the stark white walls of the decrease in Lake Powell and the canyons flooded and the layers of history and ecology that have just been buried under water and accumulated sediment at this point. One of the really interesting people we talked to in Moab, and I interviewed him once back in September. I'm hoping to interview him again, is Mike Dehoff, and he's done some really interesting work with his organization called Returning Rapids, where he's basically going in and taking old historic photos of different rapids in Canyonlands pre-Glen Canyon Dam, and he's going back now that Lake Powell is receding, and he's rediscovering them and finding out where they are and seeing that as Lake Powell recedes, nature is within real time having this rapid transfer back to its native ecologies. You're seeing native plants come back. You're seeing native wildlife coming back. You're seeing beavers in the canyons where the beavers had long ago gone. You're seeing willows replace tamarisks, that kind of thing. You're seeing beaches develop. So you're seeing it. It's in this expedited time frame that you're seeing the return of the canyons as you progress south of Cataract Canyon into what was Lake Powell as it starts to recede. So it's a really fascinating look at the ecology there.
I love that you have kind of these two different paths, right? Toward continuing to just put the pressure on water and extract resources versus, hey, let's try to be more balanced with nature and enjoy it and recreation and so forth. And that's, it's embodied in this episode in this area, but that's like the choice facing the West in a lot of ways, right? That's really interesting.
And I think it's really well encapsulated here. So this is a photo of Canyon de Chelly National Monument. This is one of my first memories as a kid was actually hiking down into Canyon de Chelly. I was 3 or 4. It was amazing.
Wow.
But Canyon de Chelly is the reason I picked this photo as opposed to somewhere else along the San Juan watershed, which is what episode 4 is about, is it's this really fascinating encapsulation of the ancestral Puebloan cultures, which we're diving into in this episode, and the reasons for their disappearance from the area, or not really disappearance because they wound up evolving into other cultures, but the reasons for that were basically they went through a 200-year drought that is being mirrored today, like the drought or the aridification that we're seeing now in the Southwest is the largest such event since the aridification that drove the ancestral Puebloans out of the region. So it's a cool way of looking at that, but it's also about the native tribes that rely on the water of the San Juan, the Navajo, the Hickory Apache, the Southern Utes, the to some extent the Zuni that we're probably going to touch on them on episode 5. This is like our chance to really dive into the issues facing Native Americans in the region and along the watershed in general, because the Navajo Nation is the largest population of Native Americans in the country, and all of these different native groups and native tribes, they rely on the San Juan primarily for their water. And the San Juan itself is one of the most over allocated rivers in the watershed. The San Juan is really the story of sort of what this balance between honoring native tribes and respecting their rights to water versus where we've been going, and what we've been doing is leaving them out of the conversation. And I'm hoping to talk to as many Native peoples as possible about this. One of the other really fascinating things about Canyon de Chelly, and another reason why I think it's such an important place, even though it's not directly on the San Juan River, the Canyon de Chelly is where Kit Carson led a massacre that basically forced the Native Americans forced the Navajo to do the long walk, and then sign the treaty that sort of set the Navajo Nation boundaries. Kit Carson, going back to episode 2, was a mountain man, and his exploits as a mountain man were one of the main reasons that Euro Americans started coming west. So to have him pop up again in our history as this sort of Indian killer, as he liked to be known, is this really sad, like interesting story, and it's an encapsulation of a lot of the ways that we've treated these native tribes for so long. So,
Sure.
So that's episode 4. Episode 4 is really about the native peoples of the Four Corners region.
Yeah. And like you said, you can't tell the story of this region, of this place, without a giant amount of time with their voices involved. So
episode 5 is the Grand Canyon. And, there's 100 documentaries on the Grand Canyon. There's 100 stories of the Grand Canyon. And part of it is, like there's a story that follows the river, and you can raft the river and you can see the Grand Canyon from that perspective. And when you're at the base of the river, I've only hiked down into it. I haven't rafted it, but when I've hiked in, like, it seems like this impenetrable castle, right? You've got these high walls on both sides that are just like so immense that it doesn't feel like anything can actually penetrate and touch the river and affect the river. But in reality, if you look at the peripheries of the canyon, there's so many threats to the canyon that are really scary and really concerning when you really dive into some of those issues. So what I'm hoping to do with this is look at those edges of the canyon, right? To have a central through line that follows the river from Glen Canyon Dam to Lake Mead, but look at the issues affecting the Little Colorado River, for example, on the east side of the canyon, and the proposed damming and the proposed skyline there's a SkyTram that they're looking to do at the confluence there, to look at uranium mining, which thankfully has just been paused at the very least, by the new administration, and its effects on the watershed. If historically, at the upper reaches of the Little Colorado along the Puerco River is one of the biggest radioactive spills and disasters in U.S. history, bigger than 3 Mile Island, yet we never talk about it.
Wow.
And it's from a uranium mine containment pond that breached its dam and flooded the Puerco River with radioactivity. And the Navajo are still facing major health issues because of this spill back in 1979, I think. So uranium mining on the outskirts of the Grand Canyon is this huge issue that affects the entire watershed. If you get a uranium spill up in the Puerco River, you're noticing radioactivity at the Delta. You're noticing radioactivity in Las Vegas or in the water that comes into Phoenix. And these are major issues that need to be looked at. And then also, what we would like to dive into is talking to the Havasupai and the Hualapai and their approaches to maintaining their rights to their land and their water, and how those approaches are fairly different between the two tribes, but still have the same goal in mind. The Havasupai are very protective. They want to close off to outsiders as much as possible, to sort of protect their language and their culture as much as they can, and their way of life. Whereas the Hualapai have seen the economic necessity of inviting people in, and are bringing in helicopters by the droves into the western edge of the Grand Canyon, and what that does to the ecology, having 300 helicopters fly through every day, is a really interesting story there. So I'm trying to tell the story of the Grand Canyon in a way that hasn't necessarily been told before, which is hard. Pete McBride did such an amazing job of it a couple of years ago that it's, that's sort of my benchmark that I'm trying to rise to that level.
Just get up there. Yeah. Well, you're right. There's been so much done on the Grand Canyon that you have to find that unique angle, but that fits within this broader story you're telling about the Colorado River. So when you leave the Grand Canyon, what do we come to next?
So the end of the Grand Canyon, you come to Lake Mead, which is created at the confluence of the Colorado and the Virgin River. And the Virgin River is one of the smaller tributaries in the Colorado system, but in my opinion, it's one of the most emblematic of sort of the contemporary state of the watershed, in terms of population. So starting up at the headwaters up in Zion National Park, I don't know when the last time you've been to Zion is, but it's
2003. It's been a while.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely go back. It's, I try to go back as much as I can. So this was my introduction to the Colorado Plateau. Like I said, this is my happy place, right? This going to Zion National Park. But I've had to find ways to go there that aren't just completely filled with crowds, right? I've had to go in off seasons. I've had to go during the week, or find times that aren't so packed with people that I can actually experience it in the way that I feel like it should be experienced. And that's a common through line that you'll see with a lot of people who love this park. I think it's the fourth or third most visited park in the U.S. But in terms of its size, it's towards the bottom in terms of actual acreage. And most of the population that actually visits the park is along the main stem of the main canyon here, the Virgin River, the North Fork of the Virgin River that cuts through it. And that's important, right? So it's the way I look at the Virgin River is it's an encapsulation of overuse in terms of maybe how do we look at sort of the recreation industry if it's pushed to an extreme, right? Zion's done an excellent job of managing the population that goes through. but they're still facing major issues. This year they had a huge cyanobacteria bloom, largely created through warming temperatures of the water, which is partially climate change, but also it's through some of the pollutants that are put in the water through so many people traversing it. And it was a major health scare in Zion this past year, along with the other, coronavirus health scare that was going on everywhere. And so you really couldn't get in the water for so long.
Wow.
And as you look at the amount of population that goes into if you go downstream along the Virgin, you see St. George is the fastest growing metropolitan area in Utah. You see Las Vegas further downstream along Lake Mead, and that's another fast growing area. And the reasons I want to touch on the Virgin for this population debate is, so going back to the north edge of the Grand Canyon, there's an interesting story that is used in sort of a lot of science classes, or historically has been used, and possibly an apocryphal story of the story of the kaibab deer. And it's how the term of carrying capacity has been applied to wildlife. So there's a certain carrying capacity that a landscape has, that a watershed has, that allows for a certain amount of animals to live on it sustainably without population issues arising, like increase in disease and increase in issues. As you remove predation and allow population to grow in the deer population, for example, you remove the systems that are kept in place naturally to limit population growth, and then you see an increase in disease, you see an increase in famine, and all these issues that affect larger populations in areas that can't sustain them.
So where,
tying
like,
it back to people.
yeah. Yeah, no, I was going to say, so, we talked earlier about how recreation is in many ways preferable to resource extraction and development and all this stuff, but you can see where it can go too far, right? And have some unintended consequences.
Yeah, and it's not just recreation, right? It's just, and I'm not necessarily taking a side on either end of this. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have population in these areas.
Mm-hmm.
I'm raising a question about whether or not we should think about carrying capacity in terms of human population. And this is like one of the more controversial episodes, I think, and it's one I've gotten the most pushback on so far. But it is a real question. Like if we are going to allow places, like you mentioned earlier, places like Phoenix and Los Angeles and Las Vegas to grow exponentially, or St. George, without the proper measures in place to sustain those populations, what is it going to do to those populations? What's it going to do to the economy? And is there going to be a natural breaking point? And that's my concern, right? Like, at what point do we get to a point that it's too much?
Sure.
So
I've wondered that about like I said, about these southwestern cities for a while. It's like you hear about the water situation, but the people keep booming in, and it's seems like a fair question to have on the table. What's the carrying capacity of the Colorado River Basin and these specific places in it? So cool. What's next on the journey?
Yeah. So episode 7 is going to be the Lower Colorado Basin. And this is sort of where I look at, the consequence of all the decisions that were made upstream. And the reason I want to sort of focus on that as the story for this area is you have, it's the terminus of the river, right? But it's also the beginning of a lot of those decisions. So the Salton Sea, like I mentioned, was my introduction to the Colorado River. But it's also the impetus behind the creation of the Colorado River Compact back in 1922. And so because the Salton Sea was created through a burst system of dikes that sort of flooded the Imperial and Coachella valleys, California decided they needed a dam to protect those farming areas. And so they argued for the building of Hoover Dam, And the reason they signed the Colorado River Compact in 1922 was so they could get the Hoover Dam. That was the carrot that was held out for California. So that was all based on the Salton Sea. And then you see the Hoover Dam as sort of the first in a series of damming and controlling measures that goes down the lower Colorado, like Parker Dam in this photo, that creates Lake Havasu, that creates Lake Mojave, all the way down to Yuma, and then beyond when you get to Morales Dam on the Mexican side of the border. And by the end of that run, the Colorado River rarely, if ever, reaches the sea in what used to be the most expansive ecological delta in the North America, if not one of the most expansive in the world. So we're really looking at the taming of the river in microcosm as we look at the lower Colorado. So the natural flow of the Colorado, which I find fascinating, is a meander, right? And it's stretched over hundreds of miles, similar to some of those meander photos that you see of the Mississippi Delta, where it just constantly weaves back and forth. There's no walls, there's no natural, canyons to keep the Colorado in its flow. So the way they managed that was to build all these dams along its length, and it's a really interesting encapsulation of how we've completely blocked off the river from its natural ecological niche, but also completely isolated into these pools that we can draw off to cities like Los Angeles or Phoenix, and really sort of pull the water out of the river by the time it reaches Mexico. The second part of the episode is looking at the Gila River, and following that down to Yuma, and that being really just completely used up by Phoenix and Tucson by the time it reaches Yuma. There's not much water that actually reaches the confluence of the Colorado and the Gila. Where at the upper reaches of the Gila, it's one of the most amazing natural landscapes in the headwaters there. And it's really kind of, episode 7's a depressor. I don't see a way to tell it in another way. I've had some great conversations with some people in Lake Havasu that are doing some really amazing work as part of the Clean Colorado River Conservation Society there. And Lake Havasu itself the city of Lake Havasu itself is doing some really amazing work. They were really, since their inception, they've been about preserving water and protecting their ability and to be sustainable with the water in a way that places like Las Vegas are now mirroring in terms of no lawns and limited sort of water use beyond just municipal and agricultural use.
Yeah. So then
I don't know.
So then how you kind of bring people down a little more with episode 7. That's the plan. How do you wrap up this journey? What's your close here?
Episode 8 is about the future of the river, and it's about sort of diving in deep into some of the issues that or some of the projects that are being done to actually improve the river. And I've had a lot of really fruitful conversations with a lot of organizations that are doing some really amazing work, looking at technologies that are being adapted. We need to be looking at alternatives potentially to diversions and dams and continued storage, and look at ways that we can sort of live in balance with the river. And so I think that's one of the things I'm most interested in looking at is how can we take a cue from, the 35 tribes that I've identified that sort of use or have historically used Colorado River water. How can we take a cue from the way that they have used it and used it sustainably? And how can we apply that to the way we use it now, which is unsustainable?
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing that I want to sort of dive into in episode 8 is how can we be more sustainable? What are the things that are being done practically to make us more sustainable and able to live with this water better?
Sure.
So,
yeah. Focus on solutions there.
So
and
have it be positive, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I guess the last thing I want to ask you then is, how can people help this film come to reality? I mentioned that you've got this all scoped out. It's an incredible plan. I'm psyched about it. That's why I wanted to talk to you. To learn a ton. You're obviously like have done so much work and so much research, but I really wanted to elevate this project in hopes, of helping it be the best success it can be. So where do things stand? What can people do to help?
We have our website, bloodofthewest.com. If you go there, we have a funding page that has links to our crowdfunding options. We're accepting donations through Patreon, Indiegogo, and direct donations through PayPal. But we're also trying to reach out to companies, organizations, people with an interest that want to donate to us. My contact email is director@Blood of the West. If people want to reach out to me, reach out to me. I answer all my emails, hopefully in a timely manner. But I want this to be an open project for anybody who wants to contribute or to be a part of it. We're a nonprofit production. We're at the final stages of getting our 501c3. So everything that we make will either go towards the production and operating costs of the documentary, or will go back into the river and to native peoples along the river. So this is a labor of love for the Colorado River and for the Colorado watershed as a whole.
Yeah.
And if I can do something good for the river, that's where I want to be.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to staying in touch and tracking the progress and connecting with you out there in the West at some point post-COVID here and exploring some of these places. I look forward to sharing this episode with people and hoping that it helps find some more of that funding and raise attention, because this is a very unique project, right? The scope of it, the depth of it, the angles of it, and judging by your photography, I think it'll be beautiful to watch too. But JR, thanks a lot. Appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you too. Yeah, and keep up the good work you're doing. I listen all the time. So
yeah, thanks.
Yeah, maybe not looking forward to listening to myself, but but we'll see. Yeah. We'll see. I'm hoping you can make magic happen and make me sound good.
We'll try. All right. Thanks.
All right. Awesome. Thank you.
Waterloop.
Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. A special thanks to Waterloop supporters, Spring Point Partners, and the Walton Family Foundation. The Waterloop podcast is sponsored by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart, stylish way to save energy, water, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Save 20% with promo code WATERLOOP at highsierrashowerheads.com. If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop.